This is 7 Minutes Cyber with Danny Lawler of Quest and myself, Sam Glynn of Code in Motion. And the 7 minutes start now.
So Sam, at the end of June, there was a story reported about the University of California in San Francisco having to pay a pretty substantial ransom. $1.14 million was the number reported, to a group called NetWalker, who had hacked into their systems and held them to ransom. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It was reported by the BBC. So the University of California had some kind of a ransomware attack whereby some of their academic data was scrambled or encrypted, and the malicious actors demanded a $3 million ransom to get the password to decrypt that data. And the BBC were given access to the conversation that went on between the victim, in this case, the University of California, and the malicious actors, to view the conversation that was going on and the negotiations that actually occurred between the two parties to try to get the ransom down from 3 million. And it eventually settled on just over $1 million.
It was pretty stark when you, as you read through the BBC report, they actually had screen grabs of the email correspondence back and forth between the university and the hackers, which really brought it home what kind of position you can find yourself in if you've been attacked from a cybersecurity perspective and you're left with no option but to pay the ransom.
Yeah, I mean, putting aside the fact that this is a crime and, the University of California are a victim in terms of this crime, the negotiation itself was a commercial negotiation. So they, one side started with 3 million, the other side started with $780,000. Saying that a lot of the data was to do with COVID research and whatever. And the response back was, look, you guys make billions a year, you can afford more than that. So putting aside the crime, it was interesting just to see it was a negotiation,
It's a business decision ultimately, but I said that's kind of your option of last resort, is to engage with the hackers and actually pay a ransom. What is it that firms do then to end up ensure that they're not in that position of last resort?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to the Gardaí or the FBI or any of the guidance online, they'll always tell you not to pay the ransom, because all you're doing is encouraging the criminals to do this again, maybe to do this again to you again. But the reality cannot necessarily be that black and white, because while, from a society point of view, we don't want to be encouraging criminals to continue to commit crime. If you're in an organization where the data that they've scrambled, that's the only copy of the data that you have, and if the choice is either you pay the ransom or you go out of business, then it's a tough decision, or maybe not that tough. You have no choice but to pay the ransom. So you need to think about, well, what are your alternatives? Because I'm sure this is what the university did. What alternative do we have rather than paying the ransom?
And obviously in that case, none, because they ended up paying.
I assume so, because I mean, in the traditional ransomware attack, the solution to that in the past was to have a backup and have that backup put aside, what they call air-gapped, so that even if you do get attacked and the bad guys get in and they encrypt your data, you have a secure copy of that data that you can restore. I'm assuming in this story, in this case, they didn't have that backup, either because they didn't think the data was important enough to back up, or they didn't know the data existed, or the bad guys got at the backups. Because again, in a negotiation, you try to identify the other party, what are their alternatives? What's their best alternative to a negotiated agreement? And if the bad guys know your best alternative is a backup, then they will try to find those backups and destroy those backups. And that's where the trend is going now, compared to when this all kicked off years ago.
Right, and of course the bad guys are pretty clever, so they're going to think to attack your backup and put themselves in the strongest negotiating position that they can. From a regulator's perspective, if that were a financial services regulated firm that ended up in that position, what would their regulator think? Well, I guess ultimately it's up to that firm to decide whether or not they're going to have to pay the ransom. And I don't know that the regulator can bless or otherwise decide for them. It's ultimately, I guess, like any other firm, it's a business decision. Where I think the regulator is going to especially get involved is after the fact, to understand what went wrong and why did it go wrong. And if it was a terribly sophisticated attack that couldn't have been prevented, notwithstanding whatever the firm had done, that's one position. But if it was a failure of a very basic process in a cybersecurity policy that should have been there and operating as required by regulators and regulation, then that's a very different position. And it is probably more likely to have been the latter, a simple mistake, rather than a very sophisticated actor trying to.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I suppose, you know, the University of California or whoever, I mean, we would have all looked at this back in whatever, 2015, 2016, even before that, when this ransomware stuff started going around. And a lot of firms would have kind of got their backups strategy in place. But the criminals are smart, you know, so back to the point, they look at what your alternatives are compared to paying the ransom. And they go after those alternatives. So as well as that, the criminals realize, well, they can do more to cause more damage. So even if you do have a backup of the data, if the criminals have taken a copy of the data and they threaten to disclose that data unless you pay the ransom, they have you again. So that even though you won't care that they've encrypted the data because you have a copy of it, you will care that they have a copy of the data and that they'll disclose it, suddenly causing data protection problems, confidentiality and reputational problems. And the mere fact that data has been disclosed to an unauthorized party is a data protection problem in itself. So it's likely to come out into the public domain at some point anyway.
Oh, there's our 6-minute buzzer. So let's wrap it up. I suppose the key points that we have from this. Oh, we can stop.
We'd spend a minute stopping the timer.
Yeah, exactly. The key points, I guess, looking at it from a regulator perspective, if you're a regulated firm and you've ended up paying a ransom, there's every chance, depending on the nature of the attack, that you'll end up with a fine as well, or some sort of regulatory scrutiny, doubling probably the pain of the situation that you've already gone through.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to be a victim of this kind of crime, and despite your best efforts, you know, if a criminal really wants to attack you, they'll find a way to attack you. But if you're going to be a victim, don't be a victim of a simple, non-sophisticated crime. Learn from others, learn from this case, and try to identify what your alternatives are now. And your alternatives now might be different to the alternatives you would have identified when ransomware started out years ago.
It's pretty
all right.
Yeah.
Okay, Danny, thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Sam.